I see a couple more people maybe popped in. If you guys haven't attended any sessions on Hopin yet for Startup Week, welcome. And the platform is, different than the Zoom calls I'm sure we're all accustomed to now in the age of remote work. But if you double click on the screen share slides, those will get bigger for you. So you can see the slides that we're sharing a little bit bigger than our faces. And during the session, if you want to ask a question, feel free to use the chat, or there's a button on the top right of your screen that requests for you to share your audio and video. If you'd like to ask the question in person, that is a-okay. We'd love to see your face and hear your voice. Makes us feel a little less alone out here. But like I said, utilize that chat if you have any questions or comments. And also, if you just want to drop a little hi, hello, so that we know people are here and we're not just talking to ourselves, that would be great. Feel free to interrupt us at any point if you have questions or comment, like I said. Otherwise, we will leave room for questions at the end of the session. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Chris, and you can get us started.
All right, thanks. Good morning, everyone. We are Rohrer Advisors, and I'm Chris Rohrer. Liz Rahn was just speaking, and Pete Kostroski. This is the squad. We're happy to be here this morning. We, in our day jobs, help companies big and small find and negotiate for office and industrial space. We've been in the Twin Cities for 20 plus years. So most of the companies are headquarters here, but a lot of the business is all over the globe. So we form teams to help people sort it out as their entities are growing. But what we wanted to do for this, and what we've seen from most of the startups that we work with, that people tend to want to try to handle it themselves from the get-go. And so while we're certainly available to help you with questions if needed, we're trying to give you tools that would just take the level of skill that you might have it to the next level, so that you could do this yourself and end up with a little bit better result. So that's the goal today. Like Liz said, we're going to leave some time at the end to just kind of talk about the market or conditions or what's gone on in these recent months to change things. But we'll first go through this piece about how you can do it better yourself. So what you generally see in kind of the space progression of a startup is, and we're a startup too, although we've been in this business for many years. We started this company in November, but is it basement and garage and home as a starting point, and then remote work from public spaces. We did this. We found out the library was a pretty good place for private rooms as opposed to coffee shops. And then people start, some people stay remote, and I think that's going to be something we're going to see maybe more of. But if they are wanting to gather or have some kind of collaborative space, a first stop is in co-working spaces or incubator spaces, and even shared offices, which we'll see more of now with people having a little bit more space than they need typically. But the tools that we're giving you are really mostly focused on when you've gotten to the point where you're saying, hey, listen, I want a dedicated space for my office. And dedicated space can be a sublease. It can be a lease direct with a building. It can be any one of those kind of varieties.
All right, as Chris mentioned, I'm Pete. Thanks for joining us this morning here. So as Chris talked about in that progression, eventually when you get out of the basement, or in our case, the library, and you say we need a little more formal environment, as many people know, there's some different options, and we've seen a lot more on recently, with the two main buckets being co-working space and dedicated office space. So co-working, that's when we talk about the WeWorks, the Industrious, the Regus, and a bunch of others that have popped up over the years. There's kind of pros and cons with both. So with the co-working space, their costs are based on the per person for each month in there, as opposed to the dedicated offices based on your square footage and your costs associated with that. Some advantages of co-working space is many of you might be experiencing right now. There's flexibility on terms where you can do a month to month, 6 month, 1 year term, things of that nature. There's a lot of great amenities that are offered in those spaces as well. It's a nice build out and some common area, and also creates a little better interaction with some companies around you as well, and people who are in similar situations. Some of the cons of that co-working space, when you look at the actual per square foot cost, it's pretty expensive. And also what we've experienced with a lot of the startups we've worked with, after a while, you kind of lose some of your company identity. And if you start to try to create your own brand, it's tough to do so within those co-working spaces. As for dedicated offices, and there's a different types that we'll talk on the next slide of what we mean by that. One of the advantages is you actually have control of your own space. So you can have, in some cases, you can design it how you want. It's obviously creates a lot more privacy in that world and helps with creating some better office culture, since you're not just in a co-working environment, it's your own space. Some cons, mostly has to do with term. So more often than not, if you're going to go directly with the landlord, they're going to require at least a 3-year term, if not longer. And there's some pretty significant upfront capital cost to build out the space, furniture, AV, and some of the costs associated with having your own environment. So when we talk about it, as I said, dedicated office space, there's kind of 3 things that we think about that as your own. One is a traditional office lease. This is where you would go and you negotiate directly with the landlord. You find a space in their building. They're going to give you some money to build it out, and you can design it exactly how you want, which is great for a lot of companies. One of the cons in that, though, is you're going to require a much longer term because of the cost associated with doing so and the money that they'll give you. They want at least 3, 5, in some cases 10 years. There's also the cost of build out and the construction and the furniture and all these other costs that add up. So it's one where it's why we see more established companies doing that, but there's some pros and cons of what you can be doing with that. The other thing that we're seeing is spec suites are coming up now. And what we mean by spec suites is landlords in this environment have decided to invest money into their own vacancies, and they will build out the space ahead of time for companies that are looking at it. And they'll also include the furniture in there. So you can walk into the space and most of it's ready to go, which is great because it saves on some of the costs and the construction timeline and all that. And you can get a little more flexible on some of those terms, that they don't require the full 3, 5 years. Sometimes you can do 2 to 3 year terms on that. But some of the cons, like I said, as you can see there, is that it's not always going to be designed exactly how you want it. So kind of what you see is what you get. You might be able to make a couple minimal changes, but that might be on your dime as well. And landlords started this trend a few years ago, kind of as a way to give them new alternatives outside of the co-working spaces that were popping up all over the place. So it's a really good opportunity to get some new space, but not take the risk and the overhead of expenses that might go beyond your budget. And then last option for a direct dedicated space is a sublease. So subleases are when a company ends up realizing that they have excess space for their needs, and that another company that has the ability to lease it directly from that company as opposed to the landlord. Oftentimes, this is a great solution for startups because it's typically the lowest cost option because you are helping mitigate the parent company's cost. And therefore, you also get some flexibility on terms. It might not require the full 5 years, or even not in this case. What we're seeing is a lot of times companies will let you sublease even less than the term that they have available as well. Some of the cons we've mentioned above too is you can't really alter the space. What you see is what you get, and there is a potentially an inherent risk of, if this main company goes out of business or is unable to continue to pay their lease, then you're going to be exposed and you could lose that space, and you could stay in there, but you'd have to do a direct deal with your landlord in which your costs would go up. And what we're seeing is we're starting to see it, and we anticipate a lot more subleases coming available in the market as people reevaluate what their office space needs are in today's world. So from a perspective, I think you'll have a good market to choose from sublease options as moving forward.
So onto the toolkit itself. And Liz might make sure I say this right. We're going to share a link at the end. The link is on our site where you can download this entire toolkit, right? And in addition to that, some of the pieces of this are going to be their links as well. They're linked in the toolkit itself. So as we talk about kind of the pieces of it, there's a process overview that just is the steps that kind of typically goes along with finding your own space. But then there'll be a link to an office space calculator, which is really the first step, and it's about you defining how much space you're really looking for. Things like a building information template. So as you collect images and components and the finances and all of the options in each one of the buildings, you have a nice piece to track that on. When you're actually out in the world looking at these spaces. And you don't have to do that all the time. There's been a lot of forward progress on kind of virtual touring over the last 6 months, but you're probably going to want to see it before not. And then what we try to do is, you generally think that there's just kind of the rate and some cash and some things involved in these spaces, but there's just at least another 20 things that are just vitally important to making sure you minimize your risk in these leases. And we've identified those for you to at least include them as part of your negotiation process. And then once you've agreed on terms and picked a building, you're going to get a lease. So you've got a legal document to review. We're always going to recommend you involve an attorney, but we've also given a checklist there to make sure that you are able to address a lot of the things that may have not come up in just the evaluation of the building and the basic rates initially. And then really when you're getting to the point of after construction and the build of the space has been done, what should you be paying attention to in your move into the space? There's quite a big gap there in terms of construction and management of that, and we'll talk about that. But in the case, and again, we're talking about direct space here. So you look at this timeline, it's really a minimum of 5 months, and that's a pretty quick thing if you're going to actually negotiate, design, bid, construct, and then move into the space. And some of the other things we talked about, if it's subleases or spec suites, the time's cut down a ton. So you might be able to really achieve it in 2 to 3 months in those kind of scenarios. It's happened sooner for sure, but to be able to really look at the options, it typically would be about that long. I'm ready for the next slide. Yeah. So here's the first step. There's a link to this on our website. I don't know if you can see it, depending on how big your screen is right now, you might not be able to see it, but there's 3 pieces in this first phase. And, you're trying to figure out how much space you need. So how many people are going to be there, how big the rooms are going to be that you want to have, what are the components, how much common area, kitchen, etc. This calculator is pretty flexible, so you can really put in the size of the room that you're thinking about and the number of those types of rooms, and come up with a pretty good guideline to start as you then start looking at actual buildings to tell whether the building has what you need or not. A couple other links that we're sharing with you are, a lot of folks are thinking about labor, and they want to know, where are the type of employees that I want to have be part of my organization, and that can be a pretty deep subject, but there's at least some basic information on the Minnesota Employment and Economic Development website. It'll give you some sense of where people are in the Twin Cities, and it can be pretty useful. And the next thing is public transportation. Again, bus lines, rail lines, etc. Just all components of things that people are thinking about when they're picking not just the size of the building, but what location they want to be in.
All right, as Chris mentioned, phase 2, there's some, once you get to your ideas of where you want to be, what market, kind of what size, the next step is to try to find out some options that work for you. Now, there's not really a general MLS or a public MLS for commercial real estate properties. There's some different databases and ones that require some subscriptions that brokers have, but there's also becoming some new options along the way that allow you to at least get a pretty good idea of most of the options out there. And those links are on here as well. And those are LoopNet, 42 floors, City Feet, Liquid Space, and at times even Craigslist. So once you've started to figure out your size and where you want to be, you can start to look at those sites and try to come up with a few buildings that would make sense. At that point, then it's the next step is to create a list of those buildings that you'd want to actually go out and tour. And there's some other forms that we have on the checklist as well, or that toolkit, excuse me, that allows you to figure out the comparison of those buildings kind of side by side and how they stack up against one another. When you've then got out and toured, then the next step is to figure out which buildings are of interest to you, and you get an RFP out to those buildings. And we have a list of things you want to talk about in that RFP when you engage those landlords that go well beyond just your rate and tax and ops and some free rent stuff too. So that's in the toolkit as well. We kind of consider those the rates, your quantitative aspects, but there's a lot of qualitative comparisons between the buildings as well. After that, you start the negotiation process, and you get to a stage where you're able to let the landlord will fund some design work with an architect, and start to see exactly how your space would come together and get a pretty good comparison at the end of your final options to make the choice of which one you want to pursue. So at that point, then you switch to phase 3, and now you've identified your building and you kind of got a final LOI and your terms are lined up. Then the lease negotiation starts to take place. As Chris mentioned, we're not attorneys, so highly recommend you guys get an attorney involved for this process. And as we all know, attorneys can sometimes make a process a little longer. That's why we say at least a month for the lease negotiation as you're planning this out. But you want to make sure that you have someone who's good representing you. As a landlord, will have an attorney representing them. You'll see in most of their lease docs are landlord favorable, so you want to be sure to address some of the items that we have on this toolkit of things to talk about and kind of get a better negotiation on in your lease document. And then once the lease is signed, now that's the first time you have a legally binding contract. So up to that point, it's all non-binding. So that's kind of important to keep in mind. You're not fully committed until you have that lease signed. And then no matter what happens up to that point, you have that obligation. And that's also when you then start to go into phase 4, which is the construction move-in process. And as Chris mentioned, that could take anywhere from 1 month to 6 months, depending on what you're doing. And there's some other ideas that we have on that toolkit as well, or things to consider.
And the 6 months assumes that we're not building a building. That would be a whole nother set of 6 months, more than likely. But the construction of movement can be a pretty complicated topic in this phasing. You've first got to decide if you're going to have somebody in your company take their time to kind of handle it, because it's a project. It's just a very detailed project that's happening over time. You've got a budget that you're working with, and you're trying to make sure you manage your money really, really well, and you're trying to make sure that you get this construction done in time so that your lease doesn't commence before you're able to be in it. Nothing more frustrating than that, paying for rent and you're not in the space. So it can go a couple of different directions, and I'm not going to go in great depth on this right now, but you could be on the case of hiring your own project manager and involving architects and general contractors that are people that you've chosen, or you can use the building's architect and general contractor, and that's not a bad thing to do as long as you have the ability to have open book process and you have somebody that knows what they're looking at when they're watching this. So it's a decision that you have to make. Big companies sometimes manage projects themselves, so it's not wrong to do that. It's just it's a decision you need to make based on how you want your people's time to be used and how comfortable you are with their ability to deal with a construction process, which is really kind of a specialty. And so just have to be really mindful of that. But it is the thing that can take the most time, no question. So that's kind of through, that's through the basic process. And again, this kit is going to be on our website with all these different components. So it's going to be there for you to use. Liz, are we going to put these slides, maybe put this deck on that same page?
Yep, so the slides will be available in the startup library. And I know, we went over the entire process very high level, but when you download the kit, it's got more detail. All of those resources are actually in there. So when we say there's a tour checklist, you'll actually be able to see that and have access to that. Because our whole point with this is trying to make it easy for you. And although there are a lot of steps, we've given you tools and checklists along the way to help make it a more manageable process along the way. So I know it seems overwhelming, but that's what the toolkit is designed to kind of mitigate for. And yes, you will have access to that. I'll share the link at the end of the session, and it'll also be available in the resource library as well.
And this last slide, this is not an advertisement for Rokos. What we want to do is give you the tools that you need to do this yourself, because a lot of the time that's the case. People want to, but we're more than happy to help you too, if that's what you want. And the typical things are you deciding to use your time for other things rather than trying to become an expert in space. And this isn't just us, but obviously when people are doing it all day long, they have different insights on spaces and access to databases where we're going to find additional properties. You'll see when you look at the RFP piece of the toolkit, there's quite a few things to understand that you should be negotiating to make sure you're minimizing your risk in this term that you're committing to. There's also a glossary there, so we're trying to give you what you need to kind of understand the things that we're indicating you should negotiate as well, but it's there. If you do hire a broker, and whoever it is, this market is set up that it doesn't come at a direct cost to you. Fees for people who specialize in this are paid by the owner of the building that you select. So while you still want to ask some questions about that with whoever if you were to decide to work with anybody, just know that it doesn't come to a direct cost from you. And I'm not trying to paint, and we don't want to paint landlords as bad people in any way, but they're in the business of making their properties as profitable as possible. So it's good for you to have somebody that's helping manage you spend as little as possible for just the real estate that you need. And with that, we open it up to any questions about the market or trends or anything that you might have or this process.
Yep, feel free to use the chat for any questions, or if you want to share your face, we'd love to see somebody other than just the three of us. So feel free to click on that button on the top right to share audio and video and ask a question that way. But the toolkit is available for download on our website. Okay, so we have a question from Will So. When would you suggest it's time to start thinking about getting a space?
I guess I'll ask one. Well, if you've already decided that you're definitely going to commit to a space, that timeline that we talked about, it's going to take at least 2 or 3 months, even if you were to choose a space that's already built out or a sublease that you're kind of going to make work, just to be able to look at the options that are in the market, drive around, see them, get comfortable with the economic terms. If you're in a sublease, you're going to be working with somebody who's not a landlord, professional landlord. They're another business owner. So you two have to kind of figure out how to make that work together. If you're thinking about a dedicated space where you want a custom build out, it's going to take a bit longer. So you at least 5 months, and again, it can take longer. So that's kind of the answer on that one. Pete, I don't know if you want to take Jay's question.
Yeah, so multiple small metro locations, non-retailing suggestions. Well, a lot of that, what we start with our clients is to figure out a couple questions of, where are your current employees, or where are you looking to attract talent? And also, is it access to your clients? Is that proximity, is that most important? But the good news about the Twin Cities, there's a lot of good submarkets outside of, the cores of downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. So the western submarket along 394, the West End area has become extremely popular. And in recent years, the Southwest market is also very strong. And then we're seeing, and that's in the Bloomington, Edina, Eden Prairie area. And then also there's a lot of other growth in that southeastern market as well, kind of the Eagan, Mendota Heights. There's a lot of new product coming up there, and people who are moving in that direction too. So I'd say just really look at what are you trying to be closer to your employees, or are you trying to attract talent? That's a whole different aspect of where millennial talent has got little hotbeds and little pockets. But overall, there's good pockets throughout the Twin Cities.
Okay, Tim, I saw your request pop up, but then it went away. So feel free to pop back in if you want to ask a verbal question again. We'd love to see your face. Then we'll go to Morgan's question. What changes have you seen in the real estate market as a result of COVID?
Yeah, that's a big one, right? People are certainly not necessarily needing as much office space. They don't plan on needing as much office space. So I think generally people are a little bit long on the space that they have right now. And that's why you're going to see a lot of these subleases. That's also why there's a lot of folks kind of considering sharing their space with others. So you're going to see a lot of options like in that way, and people are not wanting to commit to space just yet. I think there's the crystal ball is not perfect. I don't think there's one answer for how people are going to use office space. It's going to be company by company. What are the personalities? What's their business? Do they need to be together? 2, what are the personalities of the folks that are their employees? Are they introverts, extroverts? Do they want to be in the office? Because I think you really just have to be careful and concerned about giving people what they need and want. I think that another thing that we're seeing is in these spec suites, for example, landlords they're obviously concerned. Office building owners are not feeling great about what's going on right now. And so how do they react to it? Well, one of the things is these spec suites. And spec suites have been around for a little while where you can kind of avoid the construction costs somewhat. But the big change on that is that you can now do a 2-year term, 3-year term and not have to come out of pocket. And that used to take like 7 to 10 years of commitment. So, there are owners of buildings that are doing spec suites so that they can give people the option to do a 2 or 3-year deal with renewal options. There's also, I think, going to be a lot of building owners in office that are going to convert part of their own spaces into a co-working environment to compete with all of the major players in the co-working business, because they just realize if I'm going to survive here, I need to give people what they want. So, and back to Jay's question, I think you're going to see where you might be looking at the WeWork and the Industrious and et cetera. You're going to find that when you talk to these buildings directly, that they're going to start to build out little co-working spots of their own.
I think another thing, Chris, that you've seen too is, density. Whereas, I feel like in the years leading up to this, offices were getting denser and denser, and you had people benching. And, if you walked into a WeWork, you know how close they put people together. And, in the age of social distancing, that might be changing as well, of people just having a larger footprint where it might have been more dense in the past.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like my kids right now. They're Monday, Wednesday, and Tuesday, Thursday with optional Fridays. I don't know. I mean, that's what I say. I think each company is going to have their own decision to make about what they want their culture to be like and what they need out of a space. I mean, my gut is headquarters will probably be smaller, and there'll be more of these small offices in the same city as the headquarters, and in smaller cities. And each one of those situations might be a co-working space or a mix of remote and co-working. I think it's just going to be although there are some business owners that, they really do want their people to be back in the office and as soon as possible. So again, it's a culture company by company, I think.
And then, go ahead, Pete. I was just going to read Tim's question.
Yeah, go ahead, Liz. Go ahead.
If we're not in a huge rush to get office space, does it make sense to wait a few months to see what COVID does to the market? In other words, do you think a second wave will make it more of a renter's market?
Well, I think when we talk about real estate, commercial real estate, a few months is very, very short time frame. So as Chris mentioned, I mean, you could get somewhere to 2 to 3 months. However, that's kind of as fast as you possibly could do it in our world. So I think I would recommend you can start to look around now and see what's going on in the market. And you don't need to fully commit until later. But as Chris mentioned, office landlords right now are not feeling good. So it's a great time to be in the market, and I think that will continue for a little while. Commercial real estate tends to lag behind the economy, both in good times and in bads, by about 6 months to a year. So I don't see the office market getting strong anytime soon. So if you're not in a huge rush right now, Tim, I'd recommend start to learn where the market is today, start to get an understanding of where you'd want to be, and start to track that a little bit. But I don't think it's going to change the next few months. You're not going to miss out on the window if you don't do it right now. And it could potentially get even more of a tenant's market at that time. You might see a lot more subleases coming up in the next few months too, and call that second wave. Talking to a lot of our small business owners too, once that PPP rolled out and they've used all that money, they're concerned about how are we going to figure out our expenses at that point if they're not getting a second wave of that. So I would anticipate a lot more space coming on moving forward.
Yeah, I would just add, Tim, the challenge is it seems like right now it's going to become a tenant's market, and it's becoming a tenant's market in the sense of flexibility and shorter terms and different things that landlords are trying to do, but they're not really hurting terribly because they're in the middle of leases right now, right? So they're going to have multiple years of leases still running, and office users are paying generally still. They worked out a lot of the things about tenants who wanted a little bit of relief, short-term relief. So I don't know if in the short term, other than the options that are already being created by them in co-working and spec, that you'll necessarily kind of have a bigger hammer in another 2 months. I think it might take a little bit longer than that, unless you're a big user, and then that's always got a kind of different type of leverage. But
best resources to locate sublease opportunities.
So we gave you kind of a list of those that's in the toolkit of some different sites that you can use. LoopNet, 42 floors. There's a new site that's starting to get built too. It's called I think it's Show Me Space, which is about subleases in particular. That's starting to get built out here in the Twin Cities. And even some cases, Craigslist. I would also look at LinkedIn. Some companies are putting LinkedIn opportunities on there as well when they're looking for additional space. And what we've done, which is interesting too, and not knowing the size of your company, Jay, one thing that is what we've done as our team at Rokos is we're actually in a client space. So we were talking to a client when we started, and so they didn't have it on the market. They just said, hey, we've got some extra space. Would you want to come join us? So I'd say use your network and some of your other business owners who might be open to that idea to give you a little corner or a portion of their space even before they go to the market. As you guys know, the entrepreneurial network is pretty strong, and people are always looking to help each other out, and that's what we did for ourselves too.
Okay, so we want to be respectful of people's time. We're at the half an hour mark here. Thank you so much for attending our session. I put the link to the toolkit in the chat. It's also up on the screen. I did get a response that the resource library will be on the Startup Week website, but not until October. So if anybody wants the slides from our presentation today sooner than that, just feel free to reach out to any one of us. Our emails are on our website, and we'd be happy to get those slides to you directly. And if you have any questions in the meantime, always feel free to reach out to us. Like we said, we know that the kit is a little bit in-depth and might be complicated. So if you have any questions about the process, just reach out and we'd be happy to have a conversation.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks
everybody. Appreciate it.